When I read a lot of indie comics, the impression that the writing often leaves me with is that something's missing. Now, am I a great writer? Probably not. Am I someone who has all the answers and has perfected the craft? Certainly not. And if you're at all familiar with my writing, then you'll immediately think that what I'm about to say comes from a huge place of bias, but that something that I think is missing is poetry. Now, I don't mean literal poetry. I'm not saying you should make a two-part series about World War I told entirely in verse. But when I say your comic needs poetry, I mean... Actually, what do I mean? In fact, what even is poetry? Has there ever been a subject for which you personally have a better understanding than the average person? So when you see it represented in movies or television, they always get it wrong? Bancroft, you know what I'm talking about. There's a scene involving poker, and one of the characters inevitably says, "I see your raise, and..." No, you can't do that. That's called a string bet. You have to bet everything you're going to bet in one motion, or announce the amount of your bet beforehand. You can't put out the amount to call and then reach back for more chips. That's a call, you just call. Well, poetry is like that. It's something that whenever I see it, I cringe, because it's always represented using the most stereotypical view, which is always wrong, bad, or both. Firstly, it always rhymes, and sure, poetry has historically rhymed, but that's at least partially because it predates paper, and rhyming was a handy mnemonic device for stories to traverse great distances. But whenever you see poetry represented, it's treated as if rhyming is its only defining characteristic, when in reality, rhyming poetry often contained rigorous designs in its form, from the number of syllables in each line to how the arrangement of each syllable dictated a rhythm to the speaker. It was very meticulous, and these structures were followed so strictly to the point that if you read nearly any poem by, let's say, Emily Dickinson, you would find the exact same structure of rhyme, number of syllables, and meter in nearly everything she wrote. Poetry is so much more complex than simply assembling lines whose end words rhyme, and even if it were, rhyme itself has several meanings. Poems often play with similar sounding words in the middle of lines, at the beginning. You can rhyme entire phrases, there's alliteration. Hell, there are words that don't sound similar in the slightest, but are considered eye rhymes because they look similar, meaning they rhyme to the eyes but not the ears. Now, I can't only blame the media for this because I've read enough bad poetry out in the real world. But the other major characteristic that many get wrong is that in order to be deep and poetic, you have to use vague metaphors to exaggeratedly describe your emotions. I don't think I have to tell you that poetry doesn't have to be the writer's amateur therapy, but the vague metaphor trope really gets under my skin, because not only is it not true, it's actually the complete opposite. Good poetry is composed with precision. It is a brief expression that is somehow able to examine things down to their finest details. Yet because it is brief in form, many think that by describing something as dark or cold makes them poetic. They're not. The final thing that poetry most certainly isn't, as well as just what the hell this has to do with indie comic books, is that it's often considered to be the opposite of a story. It's why when you hear me say that your comic may need more poetry, I don't mean that you should start composing poems and shoehorning them in. So to be clear, I'm going to tell you what I think poetry actually is. Poetry, to me, is the art of assembling words in a manner that imparts a meaning which transcends their most literal interpretation. That meaning is the poetry. So if you think of a story as being a series of events told in the order in which they happen, the poetry is what happens between those events, that transcends the events, giving them a deeper meaning. I often think back to the movie Unforgiven, not just one of the greatest westerns, but one of the greatest films ever made. And despite not having seen it for several years, the parts that stick with me aren't the shootouts or confrontations, but the lines that occur away from the action. The conversations between characters that, on the surface, are about the events of the story, but have scope well beyond the entire movie. Yeah, well, I guess they had it coming. We all have it coming, kid. 6 words. In just 6 words, everything about the entire movie, from the world, the story, the characters, everything is perfectly tied into those 6 words. That one may seem obvious, but How about something a little bit more subtle? Katie is a 7-line poem by Frank O'Hara. It's about his stepdaughter who says silly childlike things that kids say, like, I eat paper and I play the piano pedal. But the poem ends with these 2 lines. Someday I'll love Frank O'Hara, and I think I'll be alone for a while. 2 things that in isolation could be said by Katie, or at some point the speaker has transitioned into Frank. Then you realize that the 2 lines could both be by Katie saying random silly things that children say, or Frank could just want to be alone now. Or one day Frank will love himself. And maybe he wants to be alone because of that. And just like that, the entire meaning gets turned on its head. A poem about being young and carefree and silly morphs into one about growing old, being lonely, and maybe depressed. When I read a lot of indie comics, this is what I feel is missing. There's a lot of action, sure, but when those lulls eventually come, I see a lot of characters and by extension a lot of writers who seem unsure of how to fill the air. So they fill it with banter and jokes and anything that isn't allowing their characters to try being poignant or saying something that gives weight to the story. I'm not saying everyone needs to emulate a Greenwich Village beatnik poet from the 50s, but baby, let me tell you, if you don't look for that poetry, you're missing out, because the poetry is how they'll remember you.